has been declared persona non grata by the Foreign Ministry and has been given 5 days to get out of Peru. Lima said North Korea has failed to respond to constant calls to end its nuclear program and that it was carrying out all diplomatic efforts to denuclearize the Korean peninsula. Mexico also expelled its North Korean ambassador last week, an action which came after US Vice President Mike Pence called on all Latin American nations to break diplomatic and commercial ties with Pyongyang.
Japanese lawmaker Antonio Inoki has outlined what he discussed with Lee Soo-yong, vice chairman of North Korea's ruling Workers' Party of Korea, who formerly served as the regime's foreign minister. Upon returning from his 5-day trip to Pyongyang on Monday, Inoki said Lee told him that North Korea will continue to develop nuclear and missile programs until the regime reaches its, quote, last goal. Although it's not clear what Lee meant by the last goal, Japan's Kyodo News Agency said it may refer to Pyongyang's ultimate goal of deploying a hydrogen bomb-tipped intercontinental ballistic missile capable of striking the mainland United States. According to Inoki, Lee Soo-yong also said Pyongyang will continue its nuclear testing and take it to a higher level unless the global community, especially the United States, stops pressuring the regime. Inoki has developed uniquely close ties with North Korea, with this marking his 32nd visit to the country, which coincided with the anniversary of its founding on September 9th.
Members of Congress and U.S.-based North Korea experts are calling for firmer actions by U.S. President Donald Trump to really up the pressure on the regime. During a briefing last week, Chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee Ed Royce urged the government to take measures toward imposing sanctions against Chinese institutions that are complicit in illicit dealings with North Korea. Earlier this year in April, he emphasized the need for legislation that would give the Trump administration the ability to bring sanctions on the regime.
There's additional legislation which we're going to move very quickly that will also choke off some of the hard currency that this regime uses for its nuclear program.
In his committee's letter to the administration, Royce listed several large Chinese banks that could be targets for sanctions, including the Chinese Agricultural Bank and the China Merchant Bank. Until now, the Trump administration has held back on pressuring China, as it had hoped Beijing would help curb North Korea's aggressive behavior. Back in July, Trump tweeted that he is very disappointed in China for doing nothing with North Korea, and the U.S. placed sanctions on a small Chinese bank, a Chinese company, and 2 Chinese individuals because of their ties to North Korea. But the actions being proposed now are much bigger, and if taken, would entail a high risk, as sanctions against large Chinese banks, essentially arms of the Chinese government, could have systematic consequences for the global economy and could hurt the U.S. economy as well as North Korea. But as North Korea picks up the pace of its nuclear program, Congress and North Korea experts are calling for the Trump administration to also change pace rather than relying on previous tools.
Rival political parties dug in on their differences over the government's response to North Korea's threats and provocations. In light of Pyongyang's strongest nuclear test to date last week, there have been mounting calls from the opposition bloc to boost South Korea's nuclear deterrent.
The government is against the redeployment of tactical weapons. Why is this?
It violates the principle of denuclearization on the Korean peninsula, and it's unclear whether South Korea could withstand the economic sanctions that would result. It could also trigger a nuclear domino effect in Northeast Asia.
The opposition also raised questions about the Moon administration taking the backseat on North Korea issues and pointed out that trust between Seoul and Washington has somewhat eroded after the Moon government initially suspended the THAAD deployment pending an environmental assessment. The government and the ruling party, however, were on the same page, brushing off concerns of Korea passing, a term being used to refer to Seoul being sidelined by regional powers when it comes to North Korea issues.
I do not believe there will be Korea passing. What's your view on this?
The South Korean authorities are maintaining various channels of communication with their U.S. counterparts and discussing the situation. The international community's measures on North Korea cannot achieve their desired effect without Seoul. Military options on the peninsula can also not happen without our consent.
The government also said that the new UN Security Council resolution was drawn up after close coordination between South Korea and the international community, which the opposition parties claimed was not enough.
Sanctions directly against leader Kim Jong-un have been left out, and the curb on oil imports watered down. At this point, it seems the U.S. needs to put pressure on China. There also needs to be a change in Seoul's approach to dialogue.
We maintain the stance that when it comes to provocations, we impose tougher sanctions and pressure. But at the end of the day, we need dialogue. We're closely cooperating with the U.S. on this matter.
The opposition has stressed the need for the Moon administration to review its North Korea policy and beef up its own power. To that, the ruling party and the government say that while they will review strong measures to put an end to the North's provocations, they will move forward on the basis of having the door open for dialogue.
Warned the U.S. of the, quote, greatest pain and suffering if any new sanctions were passed, and that they were just passed about an hour ago. The UN Security Council unanimously voted to approve increasing pressure on the rogue nation in ways that they have been quite clear they do not want. Here's U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, just a short time ago.
Today we are saying the world will never accept a nuclear-armed North Korea. And today the Security Council is saying that if the North Korean regime does not halt its nuclear program, we will act to stop it ourselves.
Here now, former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, who is also a Fox News contributor. Good to see you, Ambassador.
Glad to be with you.
First of all, what do you think about that news?
Well, I think Nikki Haley's statement is exactly correct. We should never accept a North Korea with nuclear weapons.
Don't they already have them?
That's part of the problem, and we are on the way in our national policy to doing just that. The consensus is forming. The establishment foreign policy says we're just going to have to learn to live with them. I reject that. I mean, listen to the way North Korea talks. They don't have the capability to hit us yet, but when they do, maybe they will act that way. So I think we're at a very perilous point.
So you make points on the diplomatic side and on the military side. Let's start with the diplomatic side in terms of what you would do in approaching China.
Well, I think the only way to get to China is to argue on their national interest as it is in ours to reunite the peninsula. You know, there's a lot of talk about imposing sanctions on China. I don't think it's going to work. I don't have any objection to it in principle, don't get me wrong. But let's say we wanted to put financial pressure on China. To impose pain on China, we have to be willing to bear pain, too. It's a big economy over there, and we've got to put the pressure on in a big way. You can believe that the American financial institutions in New York will not accept that. Yep. So you can talk about pain. I'd rather talk about China's national interest. I think that's the only diplomatic play left.
All right. And what about the military option?
Well, here's the question for people in the United States. Are you willing to live with a nuclear-capable North Korea that can hit any target it wants in the United States and use that capability to blackmail us, to force our troops out of Korea, to force our troops out of Japan, to force our troops out of Guam? If you don't want to live under that threat, then I think you've got to consider the military option.
And you say there's, you know, I need this quickly if you can, sort of a low end and a high end. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think you can hope to take out North Korea's nuclear weapons capability alone and that they don't respond, but you have to worry about retaliation against South Korea, and that means a larger military action. But let's recall, the president's first responsibility is to protect Americans, and I think the question we have to face is, how many dead Americans are you willing to risk?
It is pretty clear. When you have weapons of mass destruction, you tend not to be invaded by external powers. And North Korea has clearly seen the precedent in Iraq, in Libya, and learned a very important lesson there. I think the question, though, Ed, going forward is, what are the other powers in the region going to be doing about this very dangerous situation as it continues to grow in intensity? And I think the larger consensus is that it is going to be up to China to exercise leverage and play the greatest role in looking to diffuse tensions in the region.
What is China's biggest fear?
Instability. It is terrified that it will lose control, that is, the Communist Party will lose control inside of China. It is very much concerned about the potential for a humanitarian refugee crisis in North Korea, with 26 million North Koreans spilling over into Chinese territory. It's also terrified, though, Ed, of military conflict. Remember, 1/3 of the global commerce annually traverses the South China Sea and the Pacific Rim region. China's economy, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, they're all absolutely dependent on stability in the Pacific Rim region.
And that's really Kim's knowledge of it as well, that he knows what's on his side and he knows the concerns of the other countries. What will these sanctions do? What kind of an impact will they have? No country's had to put up with this.
It's very difficult to ascertain right now because we've never dealt with a government like North Korea's, where the elite, not just Kim Jong-un, but the military elite around him and those who help prop up that government in power, really have no regard for the well-being of their citizens. So you have 26 million North Koreans whose well-being is of no concern. As long as that lifestyle for the regime is upheld and they're able to protect their borders and sustain military control, I'm not sure how much they'll be caring about the people.
Do you think these sanctions are strict enough that they could cause some social unrest within North Korea and maybe Kim could lose his grip?
That's a very tough question to answer, Ed, because there's so rigid, the control over the information that gets to the North Korean people is so rigidly controlled in terms of internet, cellular phones and whatnot. If the people thought there was a better alternative, maybe you could see the kind of social unrest that could lead to the ouster of the Kim Jong-un regime. But as long as they don't know any better and technology is used to spy on the citizens, it's very tough to see where any type of ailment goes.
Russia and China came on board to make it unanimous after the United States softened the proposal on oil. So North Korea is still going to be able to function. What does this mean?
It's a matter of gradually escalating the pressure to a point where China, and very importantly, if you recall Xi Jinping at the Davos Forum back earlier in 2017, looked to position China as the new global leader of the international economic order, given the perception that Trump was going to be pulling the U.S. out of a number of international relationships and alliances. For China to be seen as a credible player at the United Nations, steps had to be taken, but they were not as severe as the U.S. and other parties thought would be necessary to begin to bring the regime to its knees. That's not happening, and I'm afraid it's not going to happen for quite some time.
John Sitilides, thanks for joining us tonight. Appreciate it so much.
Has the next move. These sanctions are, as your correspondent said, unprecedented. The United Nations Security Council has never imposed sanctions on oil imports, capped them, rolled them back. Winter is coming, although it's still early September here. The winter will be very telling. They're likely to have stockpiled enough fuel to operate their military and their critical industries for a number of months. But North Korea will not simply ignore this. They may do something directly provocative. I think that's unlikely, though. I think that they may do something a little more creative, if you will, perhaps in the cyber realm. But the diplomatic channel, I think, if we don't see some real diplomatic action in the days and weeks ahead, we may be headed in the wrong direction.
You know, well, you heard the ambassador from China saying negotiations start sooner rather than later. Is that likely?
Well, I would like to think so. The optimist in me says it is likely. The North Koreans don't really have many more cards to play. The members of the Security Council, in particular the United States, we have more flexibility. We have more moves to make than the North does. The North is going to react to this in some way, and one of those ways may be an overture to talking.
It seems like we've seen more and more missile tests than ever before, as you keep seeing more and more sanctions. I mean, as Leland mentioned, 8th round. I'm reminded of an op-ed piece in the New York Times back in January 2014. It was from an Iranian-American filmmaker, and it was about sanctions aimed at Iran and its nuclear program. It was titled, "In Iran, Sanctions Hurt the Wrong People." Wouldn't that also be the case for people struggling to get by in the DPRK? I mean, is this really aimed at the people in leadership?
You're absolutely right. There's at least two things sanctions are designed to do. They're designed to punish and be a penalty for bad behavior. They're also designed to inflict pain on the leadership and the society in a way that urges them or coerces them back to the negotiating table. It's been clearly demonstrated that sanctions almost in no way inhibit the North Koreans from continuing to produce missiles and test them and nuclear weapons. The 23 to 25 million everyday North Koreans are the ones who really bear the brunt of these sanctions. I think it's very interesting that the, as you said, quote unquote, watered down version of this resolution, where they fell short was in directly targeting the leadership, Kim Jong-un and his inner circle. A number of years ago, sanctions were placed on bank accounts of leaders through a bank in China called the Banco Delta Asia, and boy, did that get their attention. Now, China probably wouldn't have let that happen this time around. That's the one increment where the politics become personal, where we would really see some fireworks, I fear.
Speaking of fireworks, Pyongyang, and I want to kind of piggyback off what you were talking about earlier. They warned on Monday before this vote that the United States will suffer the greatest pain if it pushes ahead with new, tougher sanctions. What can we expect from the DPRK? The ball's kind of in their court. What do you expect to see? More tests?
No, I don't think we'll necessarily see more missile tests, because that would likely just see another round of sanctions, inching ever closer to, as I said, those sort of personal politics, if you will. I think we may see something in the local areas. As you recall, several years ago, the North Koreans sank a South Korean military vessel. They have shelled islands, disputed islands between the North and South Koreans. I think that's unlikely as well. But we may see some provocations in the cyber realm. We may see some shenanigans maybe in disputed fishing waters. I think they have a creative way of reacting that stops short of so-called red lines, or that would trigger something that they don't want to happen.
All right, Paul Carroll joining us from San Francisco.
We'll have unprecedented access. If Iran cheats, the world will know it. If we see something suspicious, we will inspect it. If Iran violates the deal, sanctions can be snapped back into place.
Working on it a long time, and you know, this British intelligence report or leak or whatever it is actually very interesting, because the evidence may point in the other direction, that it's been North Korea that's assisted Iran's ballistic missile program and maybe assisting Iran's nuclear program. But I don't think there's any doubt over the past 25 years there's been extensive cooperation between Iran and North Korea, absolutely on ballistic missiles. We know that for a fact beyond dispute. And I think quite likely on the nuclear side, too. I think it's possible. I think it's worth asking the question whether a good part of Iran's uranium enrichment program isn't buried under a mountain in North Korea.
Ambassador, did the Obama administration acknowledge at any point, or did any official in the Obama administration know at any point that Iran and North Korea would be sharing nuclear weapons technology?
I don't think they paid much attention to it. I don't think they understood the implications. I don't think they cared about it. I think it's part and parcel of the Obama administration's Bobbsey twins do nuclear proliferation approach. So it shouldn't be any surprise they didn't understand that one way for Iran to evade inspections and intelligence was to do their nuclear work somewhere else. And we have an example of that. This is not hypothetical.
Should they have known about it? Should the Obama administration have known about this? Go ahead.
Absolutely. Look, in September of 2007, before Obama was elected or took office, Israel destroyed a nuclear reactor being built in the desert in Syria. Being built by whom? By North Koreans. It was essentially a replica of North Korea's reactor at Yongbyon. Now, what were North Koreans doing in the middle of the desert in Syria? Were they there because of their long history and close cultural association with Syria? They were there trying to hide illicit nuclear activity. Fortunately, Israel found it. Who paid for it? I think it's possible it was Iran.
Okay, Ambassador, let's move on to 9/11. It has been 16 years since the September 11 terror attacks to the nation. Here's a clip from some of Fox coverage from that day.
There was another one. We just saw another one. We just saw another one apparently go. Another plane just flew into the second tower. This has to be deliberate, folks.
Now, Ambassador, we have news reports coming in that the 5 remaining 9/11 suspects, they remain detained in Guantanamo Bay. They've got a trial date expected in 2019. Among them is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He's the alleged mastermind of the attacks. It's 16 years, no trial yet, delayed on many issues related to the men's detention and all sorts of other issues. What do you make of the fact there hasn't been a trial yet?
Well, I think it shows that the whole thing has been a charade. Frankly, I would not have put them on trial. I simply would have taken them all, put them in solitary confinement, and said, when the war on terror is over, that is to say, when your side stops, then by analogy to the Geneva Convention, you can leave. And as long as the war on terror goes on, you're going to stay in solitary confinement.
What happened?